Aphorism 32. Throughout the longest part of human history, it is called prehistoric times. The value or non-value of an action was derived from its consequences. The action itself came as little into consideration as did its origin, but in much the same way as today in China, a distinction or disgrace reflects back from the child onto its parents. So it was the retroactive force of success or failure which led men to think well or ill of an action. Let us call this period the pre-moral period of mankind. The imperative, know thyself, was then still unknown. Over the past 10,000 years, on the other hand, one has in a few large tracts of the earth come step by step to the point at which it is no longer the consequences, but the origin of the action which determines its value. A great event, taken as a whole, a considerable refinement of vision and standard, the unconscious after effect of this sovereignty, of aristocratic values, and of belief in origins, the sign of a period which may be called the moral in the narrower sense. The first attempt at self-knowledge has been made. Instead of the consequences, the origin, what an inversion of perspectives. And consequently, one achieved only after protracted struggles and vacillations. To be sure, a fateful new superstition, a peculiar narrowness of interpretation therewith became dominant. Men interpreted the origin of an action in the most defiant sense as origin in an intention. Men became unanimous in the belief that the whole of a value of action resided in the value of the intention behind it. The intention as the whole origin and prehistory of an action. It is under the sway of this prejudice that one has morally praised, blamed, judged, and philosophized on earth almost to the present day. But ought we not today to have arrived at the necessity of once again determining upon an inversion and shift of values, thanks to another self-examination and deepening on part of man? Ought we not to stand on the threshold of a period which should be called, negatively at first, the extramoral period? Today, when among us immoralists, at least, the suspicion has arisen that the deceptive value of an action resides in precisely that which is not intentional in it, and that all in it which is intentional, all of it that can be seen, known, conscious, still belongs to its surface and skin, which, like every skin, betrays itself but conceals still more. In belief, we believe that the intention is only a sign and symptom that needs interpretation, and a sign, moreover, that signifies too many things, and which, thus taken by itself, signifies practically nothing. That morality in the sense which is has been understood hitherto, that is to say, the morality of intentions has been a prejudice, a pretense to something provisional and persecutory, perhaps something of the order of astronomy and alchemy, but in any event something that must be overcome. The overcoming of morality, in a certain sense, even the self-overcoming of morality, let this be the name for that protracted secret labor which has been reserved for the subtlest, most honest, and also most malicious conscience as living touchstones of the soul. Aphorism 33. There is nothing for it. The feelings of devotion, self-sacrifice for one's neighbor, the entire morality of self-renunciation must be taken mercilessly to task and brought to court. Likewise, the aesthetics of disinterested contemplation, through which the emasculation of art today tries, seductively enough, to give itself a good conscience. There is much too much sugar and sorcery in those feelings of for another, of not for me, for one not to have to become doubtly mistrustful here, and to ask, are there not perhaps seductions that they give pleasure to him who has them, and to him who enjoys their fruits, also to the mere spectator? Does not yet flourish an argument in their favor, but urges us rather to caution. So let us be cautious. Aphorism 34. Whatever standpoint of philosophy we may adopt today, from every point of view, the erroneousness of the world in which we believe we live is the surest and firmest thing we can get our eyes on. We find endless grounds for it which would like to lure us to suppose a deceptive principle in the nature of things. But he who makes our thinking itself, that is to say, the mind, responsible for the falsity of the world, an honorable way outtaken by every conscious or unconscious advocatus dia. He who takes this world, together with space, time, form, motion, to be the result of a false conclusion, such a one should have good cause, to say the least, to learn finally to mistrust thinking itself. Would it not have played on us the biggest hoax ever? And what guarantee would there be that it would not go on doing this at any other rate? In all seriousness, the innocence of thinkers has something touching and inspiring of reverence in it, which permits them even today to go up to consciousness and ask it to give them honest answers, whether it is real, for example, why it really keeps the external world so resolutely at a distance, and other questions of the sort. The belief in immediate certainties is a piece of moral naivety, which does honor to us philosophers, but we ought not to be merely mortal men. Apart from the moral aspect, that belief is a piece of stupidity which does us little honor. In civil life, an ever ready mistrustfulness may count as a sign of bad character, and thus be an impertinent thing to have. Here among us, beyond the civil world and its yes and no, that is there, what is there to stop us from being imprudent and saying the philosopher, as the creature which has hitherto always been most fooled on earth, has by now a right to bad character. He has today the duty to be mistrustful, to squander wickedly, out of every abyss of suspicion. You must forgive me this humorous expression and grimace, for I have long since learned to think differently, to judge differently, on the subject of deceiving and being deceived, and I keep in readiness at least a couple of jabs in the ribs for the blind rage with which philosophers resist being deceived. Why not? It is no more than a moral prejudice, that which is true more than appearance. It is even the worst proved assumption that exists. Let us concede at least this much. There would be no life at all, if not on the basis of perspective, evaluations, and appearances, and if with the virtuous enthusiasm and awkwardness exhibited by some philosophers, one wanted to abolish the apparent world altogether. Well, assuming you could do that, at any rate, nothing would remain of your truth rather. Indeed, what compels us to assume there exists an essential antithesis between true and false? It is not enough to suppose grades of apparentness and, as it were, lighter and darker shades and tones of appearance, different valors. To speak in the language of painters, why could the world which is on any concern of us not be a fiction? And he who then objects, but to the fiction there belongs an author, could he not be met with the sound retort of why? Does this belongs perhaps not also belong to the fiction? Are we not permitted to a little ironical now about the subject as we were about the predicate and the object? Ought the philosopher not to rise above the belief and grammar? All due respect to governedness, but is it not time that philosophy renounced the beliefs of governedness? Aphorism 35. O Voltaire! O humanity! O imbecility! There is some point to truth, to, to the search for truth, and if a human being goes about too humanely, ich n'enchante la rêve que pour faire des bien. I wager he finds nothing. Welcome, everyone, to a prolonged session with Nietzsche again. Before this is a brief advertisement of the Men's Academy, which is in the link in the description. Plus, I'm not solely wearing black and red. I have gray shirts now. I've had gray shirts for months, but I'm wearing a gray shirt for the first time on camera. There's that. Now, back to Nietzsche. I was preparing everybody Tuesday of what Nietzsche would present forward of the pre-moral, modern moral, and extra-moral era or period of humanity. But he begins first with how the longest part of human history, including the prehistoric times, there came the value and non-value actions, which had consequences, and to a degree was dreadful and prejudiced to the parents from how the child's reflected action, well, the child's action reflected on the discipline or lack of the parents, and he includes the time of China. This is the position of consequentialism, but it begins at a parental level that we should be ashamed that you taught your child this. He's so innocent of what he does, but you should be ashamed and be disgraceful that you taught your child wrongly. I would teach them much better. He's saying that this retroactive force, both of a success or failure, which leads men to think well or ill of any action. This is what he coins as the pre-moral era. The unconscious instincts were, not the unconscious instincts, but the unconscious innocence, where the instincts are discharged innocently and nobody's thinking of the results, resolution, or the consequence of them discharging those instincts on themselves, materials, immaterials, and on others. But before the imperative of know thyself came 1,000+ years later, I know thyself was either Socrates or Plato that said, you better get to know yourself, which was the first form of self-knowledge, which he'll criticize and here by saying one has in a few large tracts of the earth came step to step to the point at which it no longer the consequences of but the origin of the action which determines its value, a great event taken as a whole, a considerable refinement of vision and standard, the unconscious after effect of the sovereignty of aristocratic values and of belief and origins, the sign of a period which may be called the moral in the narrower sense, the modern moral age, which first attempt of self-knowledge has been made. The first attempt and establishment of self-knowledge with know thyself, Nietzsche would say that is the first origin of it's one of the few first origins of the modern moral age or period where conscious guilt reaps every epistemological, ontological, moral and terrestrial plane on Earth. People correlate what I would say both to the cosmos or heavens or ether, etc., etc. Use a word that suits you. But he continues forward instead of this consequences, the origin. What an inversion of perspectives. So it's reversing the perspective of something that was subjective now to objective, and coining that subjective interpretation as objective truths, which he'll say in one of his minor works as unconscious lies and intellectual dishonesty, which those two, both deceiving others and yourself while creating the interpretations as absolutist truths and maxims, became the truths that facilitate and operate social interactions or society itself. And he was saying in Genealogy and Morals, this is what the instruments of civilization is, including resentment. While this is his perspectivalism in action, he continues forward, and certainly one has achieved only after protracted struggles and vacillations. To be sure, a new fateful superstition, a peculiar narrowness of interpretation therewith became dominant. A narrower interpretation, aka ignorance, an overinflated pride, and some say an unchecked superego. He would disagree with the ego part, but in a super pride. He agreed with super pride, or being an unambiguous selfish SOB. Now that this narrowing of the interpretation or arrogance is the dominant force, he continues forward that men interpreted the origin of an action in the most defiant sense as the origin and the attention. Again, this is him critiquing the moral, the modern moral era of man, because he briefly said what the pre-moral was, and I did too, and he ties that with master morality. Yes, I'm using these terms early before genealogy and morals, but once we arrive there, it becomes comprehensive, not simplified or oversimplified. But he ties that with master morality. And slave morality is this modern moral period of consequentialism, and this seeking the origin of this intention, aka dependent on this reason, evidence as the true justice to as this true justice, which is a hidden mask for vengeance, to instill guilt upon the person, and they confess of this guilt to be alleviated uh, of not mortal, of mortal, of their soul being alleviated of sin, but while continuing the sin outside the premise of people, religious people, including the priests, sacerdotal, ecclesiastical people. Now, one question begs: are these people only dependent on this guilt to drive them? No. This guilt is a tool inside their arsenal for their spiritual will to power. The other um the other tools is self-sacrifice as a form of duty to a being beyond the hierarchy of the material world, which he would say is this which is the real world to the philosophers, but while this apparent world is frowned upon. But I digress. Men became unanimous in the belief that the value of action resided in the value of the intention behind it. People's obsession of thinking or acting beyond uh, rock bottom of I'm gonna go further and further and further to find the true self cause of this. This is what he would say earlier as causa C, or self cause, which um Aphorism 21 of the yes, Aphorism 21, he'd say once this individual absolves God, the chance, um, family, ancestors, and the earth, they think they're the self cause of everything before being pulled from the whole, from the fragments of their hair, and realizing that they survived fate while still thinking arrogantly that they're self cause of everything. And he would refute that later, or inside the aphorism, he refuted it, and later he does, and he still does here. The intention as the whole origin of prehistory of any action is under the sway of this prejudice that one would have to morally praise, judge, blame, and philosophize on earth almost to present day. Straightforward. We all But ought we not today to have arrived at the necessity of once again determining upon an inversion and shift of values, his transvaluation of values, thanks to another self-examination, and depending on the part of man, ought we not to stand on the threshold of a period which should be called, negatively at first, the extramoral period? Today, when among us immortalists at least the suspicion has arisen that the deceptive value of an action resides in precisely that which is not intentional in it, and that all that in it which is intentional, all of it that can be seen, known, conscious, still belongs in its surface and skin, which, like every skin, betrays something, but still conceals more. So that self-examination and deepening, while uh, rudely transvaluing values, this alters everything from the beginning of know thyself, which is depending on who you say and speak with, is the first self-knowledge. To Nietzsche, self-knowledge is interpretive and not introspective. Why? It's a collection of perspectives that have affected you on a physical scale of the world, and that you've translated that to a psychological framework. He would say that this has become prejudices, and that there must be a threshold of a new period, this extra moral period. What is the extra moral period? The period where you grab the consciousness of the slave morality, where you grab the innocence of the master morality and have a conscious, innocent reality, while saying to yourself, everything that happens, I'm not concerned of because it happens innocently, including the negativity of 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 life. Why is it negativity? But it's an afterthought because it benefits the positivity for perfection, expansion, flourishment, and nourishment, plus brief time of self-preservation before waging another war inside the psyche and outside the psyche. That's the extramoral age, where it's still beyond good and evil, as the work implies, beyond good and evil, a prelude to the philosophers of the future. While while realizing that agony and cruelty performed upon life itself, because tyranny, or yes, tyranny can't describe life. It's a soft and passive word for how the true exploitation, encroachment, repression of life works. That we humans use simple words to define what a complex system or a complex function life is. You can't say it's a system because if it's a system, it works every time. But because nature's beyond systems, you can't calculate it. precisely that which is not intentional in it, and that all that in it which is intentional, all of that can be seen, known, conscious still belongs to its surface and skin. That's you being consciously aware or cognitive of what's appearing knowable and unknowable, but realizing the unknowable of what's performing in front of you. And while it's performing in front of you, it's unfolding the event and how the emotions relate or retract from it, from the coil and recoil. And while he's saying this is the consciousness, it affects it at the surface too, including the skin. Say when you're anxious to perform some task you've never performed before and your hands vibrate, you're sweaty, you have butterflies in your stomach, you're anxious, plus you're scorching too, so you have this motion, you blow in your shirt, you touch your face, you if you have facial hair, move the mustache, the chin hair, you pick your nose, your ear, something to distract and detach the emotion and anxiety from. And this is what he's saying here. This is the conscious innocence. Well, to a degree of what extramoral is, but this is what he's saying, that every event upon realizing, cognitively, that it's innocent and that you're performing inside this innocence, what everybody outside of it, these exoteric, as it would say previously, love to say a yes and no and falsify the development of this innocence. That the intention is only a sign, a symptom that needs interpreting, and a sign, moreover, that signifies too many things, and which, thus, taken by itself, signifies practically nothing. That morality, in the sense in which it has been understood hitherto, that it is to say the morality of intentions, has been a prejudice, a precept, a perspicacity, perhaps something provisional, a precursory, perhaps something of the order of astronomy or alchemy. But in any event, something that must be overcome. That is true. And he concludes this with the overcoming of morality, in a certain sense, is the self-overcoming of morality. Plus, it's the secret labor that is named with the subtlest and most revered names, while the most honest is its malicious consciousness as a living touchstone of soul. That self-overcoming is self-commanding, of ridding yourself of morality that was imposed upon you. Now you have your form of morality. And he would say in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, your values and morals should have one name, or not should, but you can seal it as one name, but something fathomless, unidentified, inexpressible, but you act upon it and not share a relationship with other mediocre, exoteric people, but be esoteric and extraordinary with that value that you have. While it becomes a malicious one and you're consciously aware of it. That's what he's saying in Aphorism 32. Aphorism 33, it's almost everything we've been describing thus far. The feelings of there really shouldn't be nothing of the feelings of devotion, self-sacrifice for one's neighbor. This morality is the self-renunciation of what you would and taken mercilessly to task and brought to court. Because of this self-renunciation of being selfless, that plays a power dynamic and power relation game of weakening the receiver, and the receive yourself, while denying your opportunities and potentialities of a flourishing life. At the same time, this selfless act is a masquerade to deceive the other person and have self-indulgence of controlling them, and to a degree, inflicting pain because they're independent, not independent, but dependent on you. It continues forward that this likewise of aesthetics becomes disinterested contemplation. So don't dwell on it too much. Through which an emasculation of art today tries seductively and try to give it a good conscience, aka the early recognition of feminizing, well, not feminizing, but emasculating or having an overwhelming drive in the femininity and not a balance of it. And he's seeing this too in art. And this creates the good conscience. And you can grab that good conscience and use it on Aphorism 32 with everything we've been saying. Plus, with the intentions or predilections or deliberation that this is practically nothing, as he would say. Because that morality, the morality of consequentialism or practicality, is a prejudice. It's a perspicacious provision and precursor to what utilitarians would create in his time. But he continues forward. Much too much sugar and sorcery in those feelings of for others, of not for me, and for one not to have to become doubtly mistrustful here, and to ask, are these perhaps seductions? Think that to yourself. This would be a crucial question and teaching of today. Say to yourself when approaching people, are they trying to seduce me into something that they can do but at the same time can't, so I'm in the need of their labor? And if they bribe you with money, say, you hire another person. I'd prefer my labor and my form of money. And that form of money is joy, which is immaterial and beyond what you can present me as true joy. That they give pleasure to him who has them, and to him who enjoys their fruits, also to the mere spectator. Does not yet furnish an argument to their flavor, but urges us rather to caution. Let us be cautious. And he continues forward in aphorism 34. It's a long aphorism, but it's simple. What we said previously quickly simplifies what aphorism 34 is. He discusses what the standpoint of philosophy has the erroneous interpretation of the world, and this becomes the surest and firmest thing to what we see today. But at the same time, the endless grounds for which would would like us to which would like to lure us to suppose the deceptive principle of the nature. He says in air quotes of the nature of things from the standpoint, it's sarcastic, uh, to the standpoint of what philosophy says of the nature of things, that it's selfless, inherently good, and has this utility in this habitual manner. Nietzsche would say no. Why would he say no? He says, he who makes our thinking itself, that is to say, the mind, responsible of the falsity of the world, an honorable way out out taken by every conscious or unconscious advocatus de. Now, the advocatus de is a Latin translation to like the advocate of God, or God's advocate. What refers to an individual who argues in favor of someone's uh, beatification or canonization inside the Catholic Church. It's the official Roman Catholic congregation of rights. Well, it refutes and refutes objections raised of this person who loves the beautification or canonization of a person. So he uses that Latin phrase or parable to how the standpoint of philosophy has hitherto, or before us, been beautifying and canonizing these ideas, which morph to other forms of good ideas. Together with space, time, form, motion, it can be the result of false conclusion. And this, he would say, this is the biggest hoax that's ever been played on us. That it would not go on doing what it has always done, as guaranteed, aka to be flawed. In all seriousness, the innocence of thinkers permits them even today to go up to consciousness and ask it to give them honest answers. That's an attack on the self-knowledge itself, from being this falsified introspection of, oh, that's who I am, that's how truly I am, great, aka laziness, the instilling indolence on the mind and stagnating stagnating the intellect for critical thinking, which appears today. There's this form of laziness that trolleys on. Yes, I'm using British slang here. Whether it is real, what it really keeps the external world so resolutely at a distance, and other questions of the sort. By seeking these explicit and true, well, not true, but honest answers of the innocence of thinkers, they love to resolute of distancing themselves of the external world for something of apparentedness, in the form of the darker and lighter shades of tones and appearances of this apparent world, which involves the immediate certainties of moral naivety, which does honor to us philosophers. Sarcastically, we ought not to be merely moral men. Apart from this moral aspect, it's a piece of stupidity, and really does little honor of what Nietzsche would see um as the philosophers of the future. But this civil life is a sign of bad character, and thus is an imprudent thing to have. And here among us, beyond the civil world and its yes and no. So venturing beyond what this yes and no duality, he's saying no to. He has this contempt and saying no to one's previous self because you've overcome this poisonous rancor and resentmentful person to a yes saying of life. This yes saying aspect includes the extra moral aspect of the conscious innocence, saying yes to everything that appears before you and inside of you, including what people would see as vice and sinful actions of the human skin. And Nietzsche would say, accept everything actively. That's why I say before I leave every video, amor fati, love your fate. What is there to stop us from being imprudent and saying the philosopher as the creature which has hitherto always been the most fooled and has been on a right to bad character, influencing people in a wrong direction? He has today the duty to be mistrustful, to squant wickedly of every abyss of suspicion. He's just walking in nothing while being skeptical of that nothingness. AKA, he's created ideas from that nothingness. And people would say, well, how can you create things from nothing? You say that to the philosophers. You say that to the philosophers of their ideas. what prompted them from those ideas, from previous philosophers, and from those philosophers, previous religious people, etc., etc. So they created nothing from nothing, which continues today, and thus they have the skeptical aspect of this nothingness that they have created, which festers and is reborn. Well, not reborn, but readapted and reinterpreted today. You must forgive me this humorous expression and grimace, for I have long since learned to think differently, to judge differently on the aspect of what the subject of deceiving and being deceived. Da, 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 da. Why not? It is no more than a moral prejudice that the truth is more worth than than appearance. It continues forward that this is not on the basis of perspective evaluations and aspects or appearances. There would be no life at all if virtuous enthusiasm and awkwardness exhibited by some philosophers and one wanted to establish the apparent world altogether while assuming you could do that, at any rate nothing would remain of your truth either. He has truth in air quotes for another critical sarcasm with evaluating what their truth is. Their truth is the beyond world, the real world, while the apparent world was linely added. Quoting from Twilight of the Idols. So, but why not? But what he's saying here, why not be thinking differently, judging differently on at a aesthetic, not aesthetic, but aesthetic level of what the subject is deceiving and being deceived on. Plus, every false judgment isn't necessarily an objection to that judgment. Just include that first sentence of Aphorism 4 of this work, what he's saying there. Oh, the philosopher, while not performing on these virtuistic evaluations, well, not evaluations, enthusiasm and awkwardness altogether, they're performing on the perspective evaluations and appearances of how life physiologically affects them. While reiterating and retelling everything beforehand with another adaptation, resurrection, and interpretation of how humans should, how humans could be versus how they should be. That should be part is the conscious innocence versus the conscious guilty. Why are we so compelled with this assumption to the existence of true and false of these antitheses? And isn't there a lighter and darker shade of tones of this apparentedness and appearance of the world as they see it? Well, why to speak in the language of painters? This is, if you read in Aphorism 2, he uses the painter phrase of them employing paint that with the antithetical values, with the antithetical the antithetical faith and values. These philosophers and everybody use them for the context that they employ painters to paint and explain their situation, their morals, and their actions, while that painting is deceptive of their true intent, because that painter isn't truly them; it's another person. So they're painting a false, or to them, real world. And he continues with this question: which is at any concern to us, not a fiction, that real world they presented before us? But isn't this this objection, but not the same as fiction, which belongs to the same as the author? Could this be met with a resounding retort of why? Could this also belong to the perhaps to the could this belong to the fiction? Are we not permitted to be a little more ironical now to the what the object is versus what versus what the subject that's tied with this object predicate situation and scenario? Ought the philosopher to not rise above this sort of foolish grammar in respect to all governedness? Is it not time that philosophy renounce governedness or the beliefs of it thus far? That concludes 34. And now the short 35. Oh, Voltaire. Oh, humanity. Oh, imbecility. There is some pointed truth to the search for truth. And if man being goes about it too humanely, il ne cherche la vraie qui peut faire la bien. I wager he finds nothing. That Latin phrase is there's multiple translations this of this Latin phrase he has. And he includes Voltaire with it. Some say Voltaire said the phrase, but there's I'd say lack of what Voltaire said of this Latin phrase. What it translates to is I have it on my computer. He's include what it translates to of the point of or to search for truth is the same how Voltaire and what Nietzsche is saying this entire time, and including Voltaire, is why are you seeking such stupidity? There's a quote of Voltaire of to comprehend musicians you have to have the degree and extent of how stupid they are. That's what Nietzsche is saying here too. But this is not a Latin phrase. Why am I thinking it's a Latin phrase? It's a French phrase. What it means is, and I have it on my computer, he seeks truth only to do good. And this good includes what good conscience is, aka what's practically useful versus what practically is impractically dreadful. And Nietzsche says, I wage he does nothing, aka a will to nothing, the will to nothingness, which is the first symptom of nihilism, the desire to desire in the absence of an object to desire, where an individual would hear in the background the will to truth, not the phrase itself, but the form of will to truth, a dispassionate seeking of truth that is beyond your comprehension of what they would beyond your comprehension because they're elitists, or not elitists, but they are the aristocratic masters that they possess this truth. They prefer a handful of certainties versus a cart full of beautiful opportunities. It's these these religious fanatics or spiritual fanatics who prefer to die on a sure nothing versus an unknown something. And that concludes what 35, 34, 33, and 32 are. Again, link in the description or the Men's Academy. I'm inside. Amor fati. Love your face.